what is really happening in Pokrovsk, and does Putin have any arguments to present himself as the victor here?
Putin is repeating the words passed on to him by the chief of the Russian General Staff, General Gerasimov. Once again, Gerasimov has claimed that Pokrovsk and Kupiansk are encircled and that Ukrainian forces are being eliminated. The encircled Ukrainian units in these cities. It's a lie, yes, a lie, but Putin likes it and he's interested in it. On the one hand, Putin continues to operate with these so-called facts, and Gerasimov is in a very difficult and tight spot. Either he manages to deliver on the promises made to Putin, or heads will roll. And that's exactly why Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, and Kupiansk are turning from purely military objectives into military political ones. But the military significance of the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd agglomeration, despite the fact that after the Russians broke through to the Pokrovsk-Kostiantynivka highway, basically, as a logistics hub, they lost their importance, but it still remains. It remains as the flank of the entire Kostiantynivka-Drushkivka grouping of our forces, all the way up to and including Kramatorsk. If the Russians manage to capture Pokrovsk, they won't stop there. And obviously the further Volkssturm approach, which we saw with the 51st Army and its tail stretching northward. This is exactly the direction of the further plan, the next stage of events. Their goal is to collapse our entire front line in the northwest of Donbass. And for us, this is achievable under two conditions. First, the defenses of Pokrovsk and Mirnograd must fall. Second, this process must not completely consume all of the available reserves and resources that they have carefully planned and set aside, so that the situation from the summer does not repeat itself. They planned a strategic operation, but were unable to complete its first stage over the course of many months. And all those resources that were allocated for breaking through the front and developing success, they were wasted. More precisely, it was Ukraine's defense forces that caused them to be wasted. Right now, a very difficult situation continues in the Pokrovsk direction. Undoubtedly, from the south, the infiltration toward Pokrovsk continues as well. At the same time, Pokrovsk serves as the rear for Mirnograd, which is holding out more steadily, but this very stability is ensured by logistics in the rear. If our forces suffer a setback in Pokrovsk, then we automatically lose Mirnograd as well. That is why Ukraine's defense forces are focused on pushing the Russians out of the northern part of Pokrovsk, out of the industrial zone, to create a more or less stable corridor. At the same time, the enemy's 51st Army is encircling Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, and Severna. This is the very same army that previously created that salient near Drushkivka, which our defense forces continue to eliminate. The most well-trained corps and brigades, this is exactly where those Russian units have been concentrated. These are the troops that have been repeatedly committed to the most intense and strategically important battles in this area. The exchange fund, those prisoners. And depending on the success in this direction, these same corps brigades can serve as an operational reserve that can cut off this northern salient of the Russians. Then the situation in the Pokrovsk direction could change, if not radically, then at least fundamentally. Which way the NSVU will tip the scales right now is hard to say. Attention. The attention of Commander-in-Chief Zelenskyy to this sector is justified. And in fact, all resources and reserves are being concentrated on this sector, both on our side and on the enemy's side, because the success of the entire upcoming autumn-winter campaign will depend on this. But at the same time, the Russians understand this as well, and they are trying to stretch our forces to prevent us from concentrating resources in the direction of their main attacks. That's why the difficult situation in the Zaporizhia direction at Unattainable, Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region.
Let's discuss the situation in Zaporizhzhia separately for now. There's something else I wanted to ask you. We see that there are difficult moments happening. There are plans, there are decisions on how we could push out and clear this hotspot on the front from the occupiers. But at the same time, Ukraine is facing a very difficult situation in Pokrovsk, as we have already discussed. After months of fierce fighting, Russian troops are trying to establish control over this city. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy stated this in an interview with Bloomberg Television and emphasized that he will support any decision made by the military commanders who are directly on the ground. Let's listen.
I will support our soldiers, especially the commanders who are there, and in how they are managing the situation. The most important thing for us is our soldiers. Russia is striving for victory in Pokrovsk in order to try to convince Trump that Ukraine should withdraw from the entire eastern Donbas, which consists of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, to end the war. But we cannot abandon eastern Ukraine. No one will understand that. People won't understand that, and most importantly, no one can guarantee you that if they capture one city or another, they won't move further. Volodymyr Zelenskyy, president of Ukraine, in an interview with Bloomberg Television.
Looking at the situation at the present time, realistically, how likely do you think it is that commanders will have to make such a decision?
Anything is possible. Once again, the situation in the Pokrovsk direction is very difficult, very dynamic. But it is precisely the commanders, the senior commanders, who have to make tough decisions here. Because, again, taking Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad will not be the end of it. If anyone thinks that the Russians will take Pokrovsk and stop there, that's not the case. Pokrovsk is needed by them, again, as a starting line. There's a political vision. President Zelenskyy, who is the current leader of Ukraine, has articulated this vision clearly. Presents the political version of events. From a military perspective, it looks like this. The capture of Pokrovsk, if the enemy does not exhaust all possible resources and reserves that they have accumulated and concentrated for this task. But they will continue their offensive to the north, and that's exactly why they need Pokrovsk. In order to get into the rear of the Kostiantynivka-Druzhkivka agglomeration, to move out, to cut off the Siversk salient. On one side is Kramatorsk, the Lyman direction. Why? Why is the enemy so active? Because they are counting on Pokrovsk-Mirnohrad entering the rear of Kostiantynivka and Druzhkivka, and at the same time advancing towards Sloviansk with converging strikes from the Lyman direction. And then, what Zelenskyy is talking about, they will achieve by military means. Our command has a dual task. The Russians' plan is practically an open book, clearly visible. Our task, and this is the most likely scenario, is to break the enemy's offensive potential. To do this, we need to destroy and eliminate their resources as much as possible, which, if they run out of resources timed for this operation, the offensive will stop. They'll have to regroup. I don't know what the Russian generals will do if they run out of resources. The autumn-winter campaign, but in that case their offensive will be stopped or at least paused. And this will allow us, if we are ready to continue defending Ukraine, to maneuver our resources and accumulate reserves for further resistance.
As far as is known, the ratio is 1-5, meaning 5 occupiers remain to fertilize the Ukrainian black soil. We have literally 1 more minute, so let's talk about what's happening in the Zaporizhzhia direction, particularly in Unattainable. We wanted to discuss this with you as well.
The purpose of the offensive in the south is, which is a key part of the overall strategy, to stretch our resources, to pull them away from the direction of the main strike, to redirect once again resources, those much-needed reserves, to reinforce the group near Pokrovsk. According to the assessments of the American Institute for the Study of War, the Russian offensive in the south, not near Pokrovsk, not near Lyman, not near Kupiansk, but specifically in the southern direction, has been the most successful in terms of the ratio of forces involved to the results achieved, even though the enemy's force grouping here is 1.5 times smaller than the grouping operating in the east. But here, the Russians, we were expecting an offensive from the south based on Gerasimov's statements. An offensive in the south does not necessarily mean an advance in the south to north direction. This offensive continues in fact from the Kurakovy direction, and it is turning into the Novopavlivka direction. It has already become that. In the Hulyaipol area, where the enemy is advancing from east to west, south of the Donetsk-Zaporizhzhia highway, they are entering the flank of our stationary established defensive system, and this allows them to operate most effectively. We don't have time to reorganize our defensive system. At the moment, yes, the Hulyaipol defensive stronghold is powerful, but it is oriented along the north-south axis. But the enemy is essentially coming in from the rear, and this is a serious threat. Again, a command decision needs to be made here, just as President Zelenskyy mentioned.